Argentina isn't collapsing for the first time. It's collapsing again and again and again. This was once one of the richest nations on earth, wealthier than much of Europe. Investors called it the future. Immigrants called it paradise. Now it's a country where savings evaporate overnight, where inflation eats paychecks before they're spent, where every recovery quietly sets the stage for the next disaster. 9 sovereign defaults, hyperinflation above 3,000%, triple-digit inflation again in 2023. This isn't misfortune, it's a pattern. Argentina didn't just fall from paradise, it locked itself into a cycle of self-destruction. And every time it tries to escape, the loop tightens. This is how a country turns from paradise into permanent chaos. By 1913, Argentina ranked among the 10 richest economies on the planet. Its per capita income matched France and Germany. It was nearly twice as wealthy as Spain. Workers earned wages that rivaled what Europeans took home, and in many cases exceeded them. During the first 3 decades of the 12th century, Argentina outgrew both Canada and Australia in population, total income, and income per person. Buenos Aires was called the Paris of South America, and it earned that title. Grand boulevards, world-class architecture, a booming cultural scene fueled by immigrants from half a dozen European nations. The French even had a saying, riche comme un Argentin, which is rich as an Argentine. That is how the world saw the country. Not as a developing nation, not as a charity case, but as a rival. And the money kept pouring in. British financiers alone invested hundreds of millions of pounds into Argentine roads, ports, and infrastructure. By 1910, Argentina had the world's 10th largest rail network, almost entirely built with foreign capital. Between 1903 and 1913, GDP was growing at nearly 8% a year. Industry was growing even faster at close to 10%. This was a country on fire in the best possible way. Meanwhile, millions of European immigrants were flooding in from Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Between 1870 and 1914, Argentina's population quadrupled. The government was offering passage money, free land, high wages. In the first decade of the 1900s, Argentina had the highest immigration to population ratio in the world. People weren't just visiting, they were betting their entire futures on this country. The Pampas, Argentina's vast, impossibly fertile grasslands, were feeding the world. Beef, wheat, wool, grain, all flowing out to hungry European markets, revenue flowing in. Argentina had gone from importing wheat to exporting enough to feed 16 million people. And with a strategic geographic location, vast natural resources, including oil and natural gas, and a rapidly growing educated population, every serious investor on Earth believed the same thing. Argentina was going to be a superpower. So how does a frontrunner become a warning? Well, because beneath the golden surface, the foundation was rotting. Argentina's wealth rested on a dangerously narrow base. Nearly everything depended on a few agricultural exports and a constant stream of foreign investment. The industrial sector barely existed, and the land that generated all that wealth, well, it wasn't distributed in the way that it was in the United States or Canada. A tiny oligarchy of ranchers and landowners controlled the vast estates of the Pampas. They made enormous fortunes, but they had zero incentive to innovate, diversify, or build anything beyond cattle and grain. This wasn't a minor oversight. It was the original sin of Argentina's economy. While the United States was building factories, universities, and a diversified industrial base, Argentina was doubling down on the same handful of commodities that had made it rich. The wealth looked real, but it was all riding on a single engine. And that engine ran on a fuel that Argentina didn't control: global demand. Argentina was rich, but it wasn't resilient. And that distinction is everything. Then, the engine stalled. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, global demand for Argentine beef and wheat collapsed almost overnight. Prices cratered. Export revenues dried up. Foreign investment, the lifeblood of Argentina's infrastructure boom, froze completely. Britain, Argentina's biggest investor, had been gutted by the war and would never export capital at the same scale again. And because the country had never bothered to develop manufacturing, technology, or any serious alternative to farming, it had nothing else to lean on. The golden era was over. But instead of adapting, Argentina did something far worse. It rewired its entire economic system around one man's ideology. Juan Domingo Perón rose to power in the 1940s on a wave of populist promises. A former military officer turned political strongman, Perón drew inspiration from both fascism and socialism. He believed Argentina's problem was too much contact with the global economy, too many exports, too much foreign capital, too much dependence on outside forces. His solution? Cut the country off entirely. Nationalize the railways, nationalize the banks, nationalize entire industries, impose tariffs, restrict exports, and drive out foreign investors. While the rest of the world was riding the post-war economic boom through unprecedented globalization, Argentina was marching in the exact opposite direction. And to keep the people loyal, Perón launched massive welfare programs and expanded labor rights on a scale that Latin America had never seen. Argentine workers earned the highest salaries on the continent. The working class adored him. He built a political movement so powerful that it still dominates Argentine politics 80 years later. But there was a fatal flaw baked into every line of Perón's playbook. None of it was paid for. The government was spending far more than it earned. And when the money ran out, it did what every populist government eventually does. It turned on the printing press. More pesos flooded the economy. Prices started climbing. The currency started losing value, and a pattern was born that Argentina has never been able to break. Spend, print, inflate, collapse, default, reset, and repeat. Even after Perón was overthrown in a military coup in the 1950s, the ideology survived. Every government that followed, civilian or military, left or right, fell into the same trap. Generous spending promises, deficit-fueled budgets, the printing press running hot, and inflation creeping higher year after year and decade after decade. Argentina cycled through coups, juntas, elections, and economic ministers who were all equally incapable of breaking the pattern. Between 1956 and 2004, per capita GDP grew at less than 1% per year, while South Korea, Japan, even neighboring Chile were transforming their economies. Argentina was stuck, running on a treadmill of crisis, recovery, and crisis again. By the early 1980s, the situation was unsustainable, and rather than fix the economy, the military dictatorship in power did something desperate. They launched a war. In 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in a disastrous gamble to distract the public from economic collapse. Britain responded with overwhelming force. The war lasted 74 days, and Argentina lost. Over 600 Argentine soldiers died. The junta fell. The economy went bankrupt. And what followed was a lost decade of economic stagnation that left the country scarred. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Not even close. In 1989, the entire system detonated. Hyperinflation hit Argentina like a wrecking ball. Not the kind of inflation where prices go up 10 or 20%, but the kind where they go up 3,000% in a single year. At the peak, between March of 1989 and March of 1990, inflation was running at nearly 20,000% annualized. The peso was disintegrating in real time. Entire lifetimes of savings were wiped out in weeks. People who had money on Monday were broke by Friday. A salary that could buy groceries at the beginning of the month couldn't cover bus fares by the end of it. Riots erupted across the country. Supermarkets were looted by families who couldn't afford food. The president, Raúl Alfonsín, resigned before his term ended, unable to govern a country in free fall. His successors inherited an economy so broken that even the printing press couldn't keep up with the prices that it was creating. This wasn't a recession. It was economic annihilation, the kind of event that scars a national psyche for generations. And here's what makes this story so maddening. Argentina had already done this to itself before, multiple times, and it was about to do it again. To stop the bleeding, a new president tried a radical fix. Lock the Argentine peso to the US dollar, 1-to-1. The convertibility plan of 1991 was elegant in its simplicity. By law, every peso in circulation had to be backed by a dollar in reserve. No more printing, no more games. The central bank could only create money if it had the dollars to match. And it worked spectacularly. Inflation evaporated almost overnight. Foreign investors rushed back in. Growth returned. For nearly a decade, Argentina looked like it finally cracked the code. The IMF praised it. Wall Street loved it. Billions poured in. But Argentina couldn't help itself. The currency peg required discipline. It demanded that the government live within its means, earn the money rather than print it. In other words, Argentina had to stop acting like Argentina, and it just couldn't do it. Spending kept climbing. Provinces kept running deficits. The national government kept borrowing, this time from foreign creditors and the IMF instead of the printing press. The debt piled up quietly in the background while the peso dollar peg gave everyone the illusion that things were stable. Then, the world shifted. The Russian financial crisis of 1998. The Brazilian devaluation of 1999. Global capital flows reversed. The foreign money that had been propping up Argentina's system, well, that started pulling out. And suddenly, the rigid currency peg that had been Argentina's savior became its prison. Unable to devalue, unable to stimulate, unable to absorb the shock. And then, Argentina hit the wall so hard, it should have broken the cycle forever. Hey, if breakdowns like this keep you watching, subscribe now, because what happened next changed Argentina permanently. In December of 2001, the illusion exploded. Argentina defaulted on roughly $95 billion in sovereign debt. At the time, the largest sovereign default in human history. Not a small country missing a payment, but a major economy. One that had been courting international investors for a decade simply told the world, we can't pay. Banks slammed their doors shut. The government froze citizens' savings in a desperate measure known as corralito. Millions of people who had trusted the system, who had deposited their life earnings into banks on the promise that a dollar-pegged peso was as safe as cash, woke up to find that they couldn't withdraw their own money. Imagine checking your bank account and being told, well, your savings do exist, but you just can't have them. The streets erupted. Riots tore through Buenos Aires and cities across the country. Stores were looted. Buildings burned. More than 20 people were killed in clashes with police. The president fled the Casa Rosada in a helicopter. And then his replacement resigned. And then the next one. Argentina cycled through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. A revolving door of desperation. The economy contracted by over 20% between 1998 and 2002. Unemployment surged to 25%. Poverty exploded past 50%. Total public debt mushroomed from 62% of GDP to an astronomical 164% after the devaluation. An entire nation, one that had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Europe's richest, was on its knees. But here's the cruelest part of Argentina's story. Even that wasn't enough to break the cycle. After the 2001 collapse, a global commodity boom and a newly competitive peso brought a strong recovery. Growth averaged nearly 8% for several years. The Kirchner governments, first Nestor and then his wife Cristina, rode the wave, spending heavily on redistribution and social programs. Poverty fell. Jobs returned. It looked like, for a moment, that Argentina might have finally hit rock bottom hard enough to change. It hadn't. The recovery masked some of the old vulnerabilities hiding underneath. Public spending ballooned again. Subsidiaries soared. Inflation data became increasingly unreliable. The government was literally manipulating the statistics so much that Argentina's inflation numbers from 2006 to 2015 are considered officially unreliable to this day. The central bank was, once again, quietly financing government deficits. The familiar script was running again, just wearing different clothes. In 2014, Argentina defaulted again. This time dragged into a bitter legal battle by holdout creditors who refused to accept restructured terms from the 2001 collapse. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. An Argentine naval training ship was even seized in a port in Ghana by creditors that were trying to collect. It was humiliating, and it locked Argentina out of international credit markets for years. Then came 2018. A new center-right president, Mauricio Macri, negotiated a record $57 billion bailout from the IMF, the largest in the fund's history, just to keep the country afloat. Austerity measures hit hard. The peso weakened, but the structural problems, the spending addiction, the institutional weakness, the chronic distrust of the currency, none of that was fixed. By 2023, annual inflation had surged past 211%. The parallel blue dollar market was in freefall, with the unofficial exchange rate sometimes double the official one. Poverty was climbing back toward 42%. The economy was teetering on the brink. And Argentines, exhausted, cynical, furious, went to the polls looking for anyone who would promise to tear the whole thing down. Now, after enough collapses, collapse stops being shocking. It becomes normal. And that might be the most dangerous thing of all. Enter Javier Milei, a libertarian economist and former TV personality with zero political experience. Milei won the presidency in late 2023 with over 55% of the vote. His promise was radical and blunt. Burn the system down and start over. His weapon of choice? A chainsaw, literally. He carried one at rallies, revving it on stage as a symbol of what he would do to government spending. His first words as president were equally blunt. There is no money. And he wasn't bluffing. Within months, Milei slashed public spending by over 4% of GDP, the most aggressive fiscal adjustment in Argentina's modern history. He eliminated subsidies for energy, transport, and utilities, cut tens of thousands of government jobs, hiked interest rates, and on day one, he devalued the peso by more than 50%, bringing the official exchange rate closer to market reality in one violent shock. The results were brutal and immediate. Poverty spiked to nearly 53% in the first half of 2024 as the shock therapy ripped through households. Pensions lost purchasing power overnight. Natural gas prices surged since 2023. Consumption cratered, falling for 18 consecutive months. Millions of Argentines found that even with inflation falling, the prices left behind were crushing. But the numbers started moving. Monthly inflation rates dropped from over 25% in December of 2023 to about 2 to 3% by mid-2025. Annual inflation fell 31.5% for the full year of 2025, the lowest reading in 8 years. Argentina recorded its first budget surplus in a decade. For the first time in a generation, the printing press went silent. Markets cheered. International institutions lined up. The IMF approved a new $20 billion extended fund facility. And in a move that stunned economists and diplomats alike, the U.S. Treasury extended a $20 billion swap facility and even intervened directly in the Buenos Aires foreign exchange market, reportedly sending about $2.5 billion to defend the peso during a near crisis in late 2025. It was an extraordinary gesture, part geopolitics and part financial lifeline, and it kept Milei's program alive just long enough for his party to win a strong plurality in the October 2025 midterm elections. By early 2026, Milei was still standing, but the tightrope beneath him has not gotten any wider. So has Argentina finally broken the cycle? Don't bet on it. Here's the problem. Argentina's stability right now doesn't rest on reformed institutions, a diversified economy, or deep structural change. It rests on confidence, on trust, on the belief that this time, things really are different. And confidence is the most fragile currency of all. The peso remains under pressure, hovering near the top of its exchange rate band. Foreign reserves are dangerously thin. Monthly inflation has stopped falling, stuck at about 2.8 to 2.9% as of early 2026, with no sign of further decline. Critics say the peso is artificially overvalued, propped up by emergency dollar injections from Washington rather than genuine economic strength. And in a move that sent chills through economic circles, the head of Argentina's statistics agency, INDEC, resigned unexpectedly in February of 2026, amid reported disputes over how inflation is being measured. If that sounds familiar, it should. Manipulating inflation data is one of Argentina's oldest tricks. The human cost hasn't vanished either. Pensioners protest weekly in front of Argentina's Congress, surviving on state payments of roughly $300 a month, below the minimum living wage. Over 90% of Argentine households carry some debt. Nearly 60% of those debts were taken on just to buy food. Consumption still hasn't recovered. Small businesses across Buenos Aires report customers buying groceries in single-day quantities, paying with credit cards because cash simply doesn't stretch far enough anymore. And the deeper rot? It's still there. The economy remains heavily dependent on agricultural exports and global commodity cycles, the same vulnerability that brought Argentina to its knees a century ago. Institutional checks are weak. Political polarization runs deep. The Peronist machine, battered but not broken, waits in the wings. And the incentive structure that has rewarded short-term populism over long-term reform for 8 decades, well, that hasn't gone anywhere. Argentina's problem was never poverty. It was incentives. And until fiscal discipline, institutional reform, and productive diversification become permanent features of the system, not temporary experiments that collapse at the next election, the cycle will return. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Simon Kuznets reportedly said that there are 4 types of countries in the world: developed, underdeveloped, Japan, and Argentina. He wasn't joking. No other nation has fallen so far, so many times, from so high. Argentina didn't fall from paradise in one dramatic moment. It fell in cycles. Each crash made the next one easier. Each bailout weakened the foundation further. Each election promised change and delivered the same loop. 9 defaults, hyperinflation, austerity, rebellion, reset. And the question that hangs over this country, the one that nobody in Buenos Aires wants to answer, is simple. Can Argentina ever escape the trap that it built for itself, or is this cycle the only future that it knows? Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you want more deep dives like this, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We'll see you in the next one.